If I were to plan a trip to Turkey in order to visit the sites of the 7 churches of Revelation 2 and 3, then I could perhaps do worse and book a few nights stay in the modern city of Izmir and use it as my base for visiting the sites of the first 3 churches. From there, I could do both Ephesus and Pergamum, a day trip to each. And if I was there on a Sunday and I wanted to find an evangelical church, then here's one I found on the internet. No, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, and I'll leave it to you to make it your best guess. But there was also a recommendation, a review dated just a couple of months ago, which says this: "They were extremely friendly sisters and brothers, and they helped us a lot in terms of information. Definitely one of the must-see places." I've mentioned Ephesus to the south and Pergamon to the north. So yes, you've guessed it, Izmir is the modern name for Smyrna. It's the 3rd largest city in Turkey today, with a population of just over 3 million, and arguably it's its most important port. Although, of course, its population was a fraction of its modern-day equivalent, the Smyrna known to John was equally as important, and with the constant silting up of the port at Ephesus down the coast, it was its serious rival. And it was also seriously wealthy, a wealth which it put proudly on display in its beautiful buildings. Somebody called Strabo, who we might describe as a travel writer today, describes Smyrna's handsome streets with its excellent paving and the buildings arranged in blocks. The main thoroughfare was the magnificent Street of Gold. It ran from east to west across the city, with the Temple of Zeus at one end and the Temple of Cybele at the other. In other streets, you could find a stadia for games, a library, a large theatre, and various other temples to the many gods of Greece. Its coinage depicted Smyrna as the first, or the pride of Asia. And it was best friends with Rome. Whenever Rome had needed an ally in its wars against other Mediterranean powers, it could count on Smyrna. And in 196 BC, she was the first city outside of Rome to build a temple in honor of Roma, the goddess or the spirit of Rome. And in 26 AD, she outbid other would-be loyalists to gain permission to build a temple to the Emperor Tiberius. So Smyrna, by the end of the 1st century, was one of the great centers of Caesar worship, something that was made compulsory under Domitian, emperor at the time Revelation was written. Citizens of Smyrna, fiercely loyal to Rome, were intolerant of Christians whose treacherous refusal, as they saw it, to swear allegiance and loyalty to Rome's emperor gods aroused their anger. If you wanted an easy life, if you wanted to prosper, if you wanted to trade and barter, if you wanted to put any sort of bread on the table, then best renounce your Christian faith. Better still, don't convert in the first place. These sobering words of Jesus come to mind. Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." And if you were a Jewish inhabitant of Smyrna, then Christians who claimed that Jesus and his church were the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies were not just an embarrassment, they were a blasphemous embarrassment. You see, of all the people in the empire who were exempt from emperor worship, it was the Jews. So Christians, whether Jews or Gentiles, who claimed exemption on the basis of being true Jews, infuriated synagogue authorities throughout the empire. And they were slanderously denounced to the Roman authorities as frauds, fake Jews, who had therefore forfeited any claim to exemption. And as more and more Gentiles converted to Christianity, the Roman authorities increasingly agreed. Christians in Smyrna were about to be targeted big time. Jumping back to today, another review on Google, posted a month earlier than the one I referred to at the start about the church in Izmir, made me wonder if the church there sometimes faced difficulties making this 1,880-year-old memo to the church in Smyrna particularly relevant to them. Remember that today Islam claims the allegiance of 99% of the population of Turkey. In capitals, on Google's review page, it shouts, "Religion is Islam in the sight of Allah. There is no God other than Allah. Know that." It was to his beleaguered, suffering, yet faithful followers in Smyrna that the Christ who had conquered death spoke these words. "I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan." Jesus knew what they were going through. He always knows what his people are going through. He knows what we are going through, what you are going through. But let's face it, the church in the West has, in practice, long been exempt from serious, systematic persecution. So much so that we might even consider it our right to be exempt. And some of Paul's words can seem strangely irrelevant to our years. Philippians 1 and verse 29, "It has been granted to you," writes Paul, "on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him." Chapter 3 and verse 10, Paul says, "I want to know Christ." Yes, to know the power of his resurrection and the participation or fellowship in his sufferings. And then in Romans 8, verse 17, "Now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory." And then there's the Apostle Peter, 1 Peter 4 and verses 12 to 14. "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you," he writes, "as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice, inasmuch as you participate or fellowship in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you." Furthermore, the glorified Christ tells Christians in Smyrna that he also sees things differently. In this world, they are desperately poor, destitute, impoverished. But Christ calls them out as rich. From heaven's perspective, things looked very different. But that's the whole point of the book of Revelation being a revelation. What is otherwise unseen on earth is revealed so that Christians like those in Smyrna could glimpse things from heaven's point of view. We also need to take that on board. I know I do. I might not be able to make sense of what is going on in the world, but my Lord does. And in him we trust, do we not? To him we remain faithful, don't we? I call on another apostle, James, to add his voice to those of Paul and Peter. James 1 and verses 9 and 10 and then verse 12. "Believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wild flower." Blessed are those who persevere under trial, because having stood the test, they will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. Now, James's reference to the crown of life brings me back to our text. Jesus doesn't promise the church in Smyrna that things are going to get any easier. In fact, things were about to get a whole lot worse. But that didn't mean that all was lost. It's that different eternal perspective again. The latest version of the New International Version translation of the Bible slightly paraphrases our text. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. The English Standard Version is more literal. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. In Ephesus, the promise was the tree of life, an image that, as we saw, would have particularly resonated for the people in Ephesus. For those in Smyrna, the same promise was captured with reference to the crown of life, which would have resonated with them for a number of reasons. Two Greek words are translated crown in our English New Testaments. One refers to a royal crown, from which we get the English word diadem, and the other, Stephanos, to crowns that others could wear. And it's the latter that's used here, Stephanos. And by the way, it's also the word John uses in his gospel when referring to the crown of thorns that was placed on Jesus's head. To understand this, we need a bit more background geography. Towering above the port of Smyrna was an unmissable, conical-shaped hill known as Mount Pagos, and its summit was circled with beautiful public buildings that contemporaries referred to as Smyrna's crown. So in much the same way as the Statue of Liberty tells you that you were in New York, or the Eiffel Tower that you've arrived in Paris, or the Big Ben in London, so the crown at the top of Mount Pagos identified Smyrna from miles around. There was also the crown of victory in the games for which Smyrna was famous, and the crowns worn at marriages and other festal occasions. And then there was Smyrna's honours system, we could call it, the equivalent of our New Year's honours for OBEs and MBEs and all that. Crowns were awarded for faithful service to the city, and there are images of the great and the good of Smyrna wearing such crowns depicted on the coins of Smyrna from this period. The poor, wretched Christians of Smyrna were promised a far better crown than any that Smyrna could offer, the crown of life from the one who had defeated death and is crowned King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The risen Lord tells them that many would be imprisoned for 10 days, an expression that meant for a short while, much as we might say for about a fortnight. Oh, by the way, people didn't get prison sentences in Roman times. Prisons were only for those who had been remanded in custody, as we would put it today, and were awaiting trial. A flogging or exile or a death sentence was the punishment for those found guilty, but not a period of imprisonment. So the words of Jesus, "Don't be afraid," were addressed to those who, in prison, were in all probability going to be executed. What does this say to us today? Do you know what? I'd like to be able to omit the even to the point of death bit and replace it with 3 dots. Be faithful, and I will give you the crown of life. Surely the even to the point of death bit applies to others in other parts of the world. And so, as I was preparing this sermon, I found myself resisting what I was sensing. Is the Lord telling us that we are not to be surprised if things get worse, not better, for Christians in the UK? that this isn't just a memo to a beleaguered church at the end of the 1st century, or to the church in Izmir today. We shouldn't just find it interesting, but see in it a call to take seriously the need to future-proof our faith, and especially as biblically faithful Christianity becomes increasingly unpopular, sidelined in our culture and day. Food for thought. And now to a piece of early church history with which I want to close. The Apostle John, in all likelihood, passed on the baton of church leadership to someone called Polycarp, known as the Bishop of Smyrna. When an old man, he was executed for his faith, burnt at the stake, in fact. This is what the history books tell us happened. It was February the 22nd, AD 156, there or thereabouts. At the entreaty of his congregation, Polycarp had fled, but he was tracked down to his hiding place. But he made no attempt to flee. Instead, he offered food and drink to his captors and asked permission to retire for prayer, which was granted. 2 hours later, as they made their way back to Smyrna, the officer in charge urged him to recant. "What harm can it do," he asked, "to sacrifice to the emperor?" Polycarp refused. Again, when in the amphitheatre, the proconsul urged him to do the same, and so revile the Christ. To which Polycarp famously replied, 86 years have I served him, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me?" After further threats, which Polycarp ignored, he ordered that Polycarp should be burnt at the stake. And even though it was a Sabbath, Jews joined Gentiles in eagerly gathering wood for the fire. After one last prayer, the fire was kindled, but as the wind drove the flames away from him, prolonging his agony, a soldier's sword put Polycarp out of his misery. I've no doubt that Polycarp many times would have pondered and drawn strength from the words of Christ to the church at Smyrna. Let us do the same. God bless.